Marlene Santana was just 3 days old when she was forcibly abducted from her mother's arms in Brooklyn, New York, on October 21, 1985. The kidnapping occurred outside Brookdale Hospital as Marlene's mother was leaving the maternity ward to take her newborn daughter home. Moments earlier, Marlene's mother, 23-year-old Francesca Santana, had encountered an unfamiliar woman near the nursery. This woman openly admired her baby, calling little Marlene, quote, the prettiest and most quiet infant there. Francesca appreciated the kind words and had no reason to suspect the stranger's intentions. She could not have imagined that this same woman would soon turn a joyful day into a nightmare. That evening around 9:30 p.m., as Francesca left the hospital accompanied by her little one and her relatives, the same woman confronted them, holding a weapon. The stranger announced she had been waiting all day and suddenly pointed the weapon at the baby's head, threatening to shoot if they did not cooperate. The terrified mother and her two companions were forced to walk about 6 blocks away from the hospital into a desolate area near a junkyard. Initially, Francesca thought it might be a robbery, but the true motive became clear when the woman demanded that Marlene be handed over. Desperate to save her child's life, Francesca complied, and after all, what choice did she have when this woman had a weapon pointed at Marlene? In a final plea, the distraught mother even gave the abductor her phone number and begged her to call. The kidnapper then jumped into a waiting car driven by an accomplice and sped away with baby Marlene. With that, the Santana family's newborn daughter had vanished into the night, never to be seen again. Shocked and heartbroken, Francesca and her relatives rushed to notify the police immediately after the abduction. Investigators quickly mobilized, and detectives were assigned to the case within hours. Francesca was able to provide details of the getaway vehicle, describing it as a white 1976 Chevy Malibu, with red lettering on the door. This car was possibly an unlicensed taxi, which suggested the abductor had planned her escape in advance. At the hospital, police interviewed staff and witnesses to gather a description of the unknown woman who had interacted with the baby's mother. A sketch of the suspect was soon drawn from these accounts. And yes, this is one of those times where you're going to want to look at the screen if you just listen. I've seen a lot of police sketches before, but this woman's malevolence and cruelty is somehow perfectly captured by the forensic artist. The woman was described as being around 5'2" and appeared to be in her mid to late 20s in 1985. Witnesses noted she had light reddish blonde hair, but that it was possibly dyed or a wig. According to witnesses, she was identified as likely being a Hispanic female, which some speculate may be why she targeted Marlene Santana, but I'll come back to that. From the beginning, law enforcement suspected that the kidnapper's motive was deeply personal rather than financial. There was no ransom demand or contact from the abductor despite the mother's plea to call her. Some investigators theorized that the culprit was not a professional criminal, but rather an emotionally unstable woman who was unable to have a child of her own. This profile fit a pattern seen in some infant abductions. A woman who has suffered a miscarriage or stillbirth, and in desperation, abducts a baby to raise as her own. Because in these cases the woman was already pregnant, the woman can simply register the abducted baby as her own, claiming that she gave birth at home. Notably, some have speculated that the mysterious woman may have abducted Marlene because she looked like she could plausibly be her own baby. Detectives pursued this angle by checking hospital records and investigating women in the area who had recently lost a baby or suffered a miscarriage. Despite these efforts, no viable suspect was identified. The trail was frustratingly cold, with the abductor having vanished without leaving clear clues to her identity. I do have to question how this woman had access to the maternity ward without leaving some form of identification with staff. But that said, I suppose maternity wards are accustomed to having visitors come and go, and security and privacy regulations in the 80s were different beasts than they are today. In a strange coincidence, another infant was kidnapped in New York City just one day before Marlene's abduction. On October 20th, 1985, a 2-month-old boy named Christopher Morgan was snatched from a Manhattan hospital by a woman impersonating a nurse. That case, however, saw a swift resolution. The baby boy was found safe a few days later at the home of his abductor. She had tried to pass him off as her own child after experiencing a stillbirth. Police soon arrested that woman and determined that her crime was unrelated to Marlene's disappearance. In the days and weeks following Marlene's abduction, the case received significant media attention in the New York area. Francesca made heart-wrenching public pleas for her daughter's return. Despite widespread news coverage and the dissemination of the suspect's sketch, detectives reported no major leads in Marlene's case. The lack of progress was understandably agonizing for the family. As months turned into years with no answers, the Santanas were left to grapple with fear and grief. Marlene's father, Thomas, had been in the Dominican Republic at the time of the birth, and after the incident, he and Francesca decided it was too painful to remain in the United States. They returned home to raise their other children, all while keeping hope alive that Marlene might one day be found. The family went on to have 2 more children back in the Dominican Republic. While some have suggested the family leaving the United States is potentially suspicious, the authorities have ruled out the family as being involved in the crime. Further, all members of the family were always fully cooperative and open with the police and the investigation. On the investigative front, Marlene's case has remained open and periodically received renewed attention. The way I personally found out about this case was through an old segment on Unsolved Mysteries, and like many, the case has always stuck with me given the horror of it. This segment initially aired in January 1989 and was periodically re-aired over the following decades before making its way onto streaming services. This segment has led to hundreds of leads over the years, but none have panned out. Agencies have released age-progressed images to show what Marlene might look like as she grew older. Law enforcement also publicized a distinctive detail that could help identify Marlene. She was born with a slight foot deformity, causing her feet to curve inward in a C shape. If Marlene is alive, this congenital trait might still be observable and serve as a clue to her identity. Today, Marlene would be nearly 40 years old, and her case remains unsolved. Thankfully, her information is maintained in missing persons databases, including DNA profiles from her biological family, in hopes of a future match. In the absence of a resolution, several theories have been explored regarding what happened to baby Marlene. The prevailing theory among law enforcement is that the abductor was a woman desperate for a child to call her own. And since I've already gone over that theory, there's no need to rehash it. Another theory considered both by authorities and the public is that Marlene might have been abducted for an illegal adoption or baby selling scheme. In the mid-1980s, there were fears of underground networks that would obtain infants and sell them to adoptive parents willing to pay. It's conceivable that the woman who took Marlene was acting as a broker or agent for such a black market adoption. Under this scenario, Marlene could have been handed off to another individual or family shortly after the abduction and raised far from New York. Some have speculated she might even have been taken out of the country as an infant, making her much harder to trace. However, investigators generally doubt that this was a professionally planned crime. The abductor's brazen approach, grabbing a baby in person with a weapon, and her emotional interaction with the mother suggest a crime of opportunity fueled by personal emotion. Notably, while trafficking operations do exist, no evidence of a wider adoption ring was ever uncovered in connection with Marlene's disappearance. On occasion, women of roughly Marlene's age have come forward, wondering if they might be the missing child, especially if they grew up without birth records or with uncertain family histories. Authorities have investigated a few such cases, including conducting DNA tests to check for a match to Marlene's family, but so far none have confirmed her identity. The authorities continue to work under the belief that Marlene is alive, or at least that she wasn't slain by her abductor. While it is possible that Marlene did not survive long after the abduction, there is no direct evidence of harm, and the consensus of investigators is that the kidnapper wanted the baby alive. So I feel like I've said this many times before, but this is a case that will likely be solved through the popularization of DNA testing services. If Marlene did survive, I imagine that one day she may hand her DNA over to find out all the details on her background and find out she has a bunch of familial connections that make no sense. Marlene's immediate family still lives in the Dominican Republic, but I hope they've entered their DNA into all the big testing services so they can match if this ever occurs. 13-year-old Russell Evans was a popular 8th grader in Spokane, Washington, known for his love of basketball and friendly personality. On the night of June 3rd, 1989, he spent time hanging out with friends at a local park in Spokane's South Hill neighborhood. In the early hours of June 4th, Russell was found gravely injured on a residential roadway near his home after what appeared to be a hit-and-run incident. He was barely conscious and repeatedly calling out the name Brian as passers-by quickly rushed to assist him. Russell was taken to Sacred Heart Hospital around 1:30 a.m., but despite emergency surgery and hours of effort, he succumbed to his injuries later that morning. His unexplained death would spark a years-long quest for answers. On June 3rd, 1989, a few hours before the tragedy, Russell and his best friend Aaron were at Thornton Murphy Park, enjoying a typical weekend evening. The mood shifted when two older teenagers, unfamiliar to Russell and Aaron, approached and began harassing Aaron's girlfriend, allegedly trying to give her a phone number. An argument erupted, nearly turning physical until Russell intervened to defend his friend. And one thing about Russell you should know is that despite being 13 years old, he already stood 6'3", so he was no easy target for these older teens. One of the older teens issued a parting threat as they left, warning that he might, quote, send his homeboys after Russell and Aaron. One of the teens even shouted further violent threats before driving off, strongly implying that said homeboys weren't looking to throw down in accordance with Queensberry rules. Unsettled, Russell and his friends decided to leave the park. Russell spent the next few hours at another friend's house to cool off. Just after midnight, at about 12:30 a.m. on June 4th, he phoned his father to say he was on his way home. Russell began the short walk home through the quiet neighborhood. Along the way, he ran into a friend, 14-year-old Syed Madison, and the two chatted briefly before parting. Madison would be the last person confirmed to see Russell alive. Around 1 a.m., a driver named Sandy Ferris and her friend were coming down South Thor Street when her headlights caught a shocking sight: Russell's body lying in the road near the median. Sandy stopped and rushed to help. She found Russell badly injured but conscious. When she asked what happened, he was in pain and kept calling for someone named Brian. She believed that he was calling out to Brian, believing that he would come to his rescue. Also keep the name Brian in mind because we're going to come back to him shortly. Sandy immediately called for an ambulance and paramedics arrived and noted Russell's severe injuries, which were apparently consistent with a vehicle impact. Notably, the paramedics found that Russell wasn't wearing any shoes, something which will become a point of contention. He was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. Tragically, despite doctors' efforts through the night, Russell succumbed to severe internal injuries on the morning of June 4th, 1989. Investigators from the Spokane Police Department treated the case as a fatal hit-and-run accident from the start. Physical evidence at the scene strongly supported the possibility of a car strike. Russell's shoes had been knocked off his feet by the force of impact and were found about 75 feet away from where his body came to rest. The Spokane authorities explained that upon impact, his shoes likely flew from his body, an explanation that many amateurs and professionals have found dubious at best. Notably, the forensic pathologist examined the injuries and concluded they were consistent with being struck from behind by a vehicle bumper. Investigators even speculated about the type of vehicle, suggesting an unknown driver, possibly in a pickup truck given Russell's height and the wound locations, hit him and fled the scene. Because Russell had been involved in a dispute earlier that night, police questioned the two teens from the park altercation to rule out any deliberate attack. Both teens denied any involvement or being in a gang, and each passed a lie detector test. By the end of that first week, authorities publicly ruled out their involvement in Russell's death. With no eyewitness to the collision and no immediate suspects, the working theory remained that Russell was the victim of an unknown hit-and-run driver unconnected to the night's events. Unsatisfied with the initial conclusions, the Evans family launched their own investigation. After reviewing the police reports and scene photographs, John and Sue Evans became convinced that Russell had been attacked before any car ever hit him. They noted that Russell's injuries looked more like the result of a physical altercation. He had bruises on his face and arms that looked consistent with an assault, as if someone had grabbed and punched him. Strikingly, he lacked the deep scrapes or road rash one would expect if a body his size had been hurled across pavement at high speed. Fortunately, his family had the means to hire a second pathologist to review the case, because if they weren't able to do this, this is likely where the investigation would have ground to a halt. This expert agreed that there were signs Russell had been in a physical altercation prior to his death, noting bruised knuckles and unexplained trauma on his back. This pathologist agreed that a vehicle impact occurred at some point, but also concluded Russell fought for his life that night. Given the lack of road rash on Russell's body, the family, with the assistance of the pathologist, came up with an alternative theory. They believed that Russell was ambushed and beaten while walking home, then held in place and struck with a vehicle to make the whole event look like a much more routine hit and run. The mysterious Brian, whom Russell cried out for, also became a focus of inquiry. It turns out Brian was a close friend of Russell's who lived nearby. Curiously, on the night of the supposed hit and run, someone named Brian had called the hospital asking about Russell's condition very soon after the incident. Russell's family found this suspicious, given that no one could have known that he was in the emergency room at that hour, unless they were at the scene. Sandy Ferris, the motorist who found Russell, reported that as police arrived, she saw a teenage boy in white shorts lurking on a hillside near the site, who then ran off into the darkness. She immediately told an officer, but in the chaos, the information was not pursued at the time. John Evans, Russell's dad, confronted Russell's friend Brian the next day, asking what he had been wearing that night. Brian allegedly said he'd worn white shorts and a white t-shirt, matching the figure Sandy saw, but swore he wasn't in the area when Russell was hit. Later, when police interviewed Brian, he oddly denied even owning white shorts. These inconsistencies fueled the family's suspicions that Brian knew more than he was admitting. Some have speculated Brian may have been with Russell during the attack, but was scared into silence by the perpetrators. The police, however, disagreed and believed that the person Sandy Ferris saw was likely a random bystander drawn to the area by the commotion. To this day, the exact role, if any, of Brian in Russell's last moments remains an open question. By late 1989, despite the Evans family's pleas, Spokane police maintained there was insufficient proof of foul play, and the case began to turn cold. In 1996, John and Sue Evans hired a private investigator to re-examine the case, and this spurred new witnesses to come forward with some disturbing accounts. Now, I should mention here that these statements are based largely upon what these individuals heard other people saying these gang members said. Yeah, so not the most reliable form of evidence, and I don't put incredible evidentiary weight on it, but it's something. According to statements collected by the investigator, local gang members had bragged about assaulting Russell with a club and then running him over with a car. The statements also suggest the group discussed creating an alibi and threatening anyone who knew the truth into keeping quiet. Based on these leads, the Evans family identified specific individuals they believed were responsible, and even a vehicle that might have been used in the crime. Despite these revelations, law enforcement's stance barely shifted. Spokane police said they did investigate the new tips, but in their view, the evidence still wasn't strong enough to overcome the original accident ruling. According to them, the teens implicated by the witnesses had already been cleared earlier, and prosecutors declined to file any charges without direct proof. Anyway, the Russell Evans case really doesn't sit right with me. There are too many inconsistencies, too many details that don't line up with a simple hit and run. Even if the truth can't be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, it's fairly clear that something more sinister than a simple hit and run happened that night. Unfortunately, given the passage of time and given the way the investigation was handled, I find it difficult to believe that the truth will ever be fully known for Russell's case. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a reminder to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Now let's get back to business. The disappearance of 19-year-old Sonja Engelbrecht in April 1995 has become one of Germany's most notorious cold cases. Engelbrecht went missing on the night of April 10, 1995 in Munich, and for decades her fate remained unknown. On April 10, 1995, Sonja went out for the evening with a close friend. They met at Munich's Central Station around 9:15 p.m. and went to a bar popular with the alternative music crowd. After a few hours out, the pair left for home around 2 a.m. on April 11th. They walked to Stiegelmeierplatz, a central square, where Sonja intended to call her sister from a payphone for a ride. As they reached the square around 2:30 a.m., her companion saw his night train arriving. He quickly handed Sonja his phone card and ran to catch the train, leaving her alone at the phone booth. And I want you to remember the fact that this companion said she was both in the phone booth and had the phone card the last he saw her. Because trust me, this will be important. That was the last time Sonja was seen alive, and no trace of her was to be seen again for almost 3 decades. Sonja's parents reported her missing later that day, but the police were initially slow to react. Because Sonja was an adult, and there were no obvious signs of foul play, officers first assumed she might have left on her own and would reappear. Sonja's parents explained to them that this was highly out of character, but even so, no actions were taken, and police reiterated that she would turn up. When this didn't happen, the case was escalated, but by that time it was way too late. About 2 weeks after her disappearance, a special task force was assigned to investigate her disappearance. This team of 6 detectives conducted an extensive investigation, interviewing dozens of witnesses and following up on many tips. Again, though, I need to reiterate that the police took no steps to begin with, likely allowing key evidence to fall through the cracks permanently. Early on, the friend who had been with Sonja that night was thoroughly questioned and then ruled out as a suspect. Investigators explored various leads, but nothing concrete was found. With no solid clues, police came to believe that Sonja had likely succumbed to foul play, even telling her parents they might have to wait until her body is found to get any answers. And though it feels almost needless to say it, this investigation has faced numerous criticisms over the years. From early on, Sonia's family pushed hard for progress, advocating for their daughter in the media and hiring a private detective. The Engelbrechts also voiced significant doubts about the timeline provided by Sonia's companion. Notably, his story has a potentially significant hole. Sonia's sister never received the phone call she was supposed to make, despite the fact that the male friend left her in the phone booth with the calling card. Despite the suspicions, police maintained that the friend's account matched all investigative findings and reaffirmed that he was not involved. By the late 1990s, with no leads or official suspects, the case went cold. In the ensuing years, investigators periodically revisited Sonia's case, and the media kept it in the public eye. In 2010, a TV segment about the case prompted several women to report that a strange man had approached them in Munich on the night Sonia disappeared. Unfortunately, these women had not given this information to the initial investigators back in 1995, and ultimately this individual was never identified. The case continued to attract national attention throughout Germany over the course of the 2010s, leading police to continue to make an effort to solve what was then her disappearance. And just to go off script here for a second, this is one of the reasons why discussing cold cases is so important. The authorities, as a general rule, seem to apply their limited investigative resources to cold cases proportionally to how well publicized a case is. A major turning point in the case came in mid-2020. In a forest near Kipfenberg, about 50 miles north of Munich, a forestry worker discovered a human thigh bone. In November 2021, it was publicly announced that DNA tests confirmed the bone was Sonia's, conclusively proving that she was deceased. In March 2022, police organized a thorough search of the area and found additional bones in a hidden crevice not far from the first site. Notably, her body had been wrapped in heavy construction-style plastic sheets. This suggested the perpetrator may have been someone with easy access to such materials, such as a tradesman. Interestingly, there was a construction trade show being held in Munich around that time, though this may be more of a complicating factor than anything. Notably, the trade show drew people from around Europe and worldwide, potentially meaning the perpetrator wasn't even from Munich, let alone Germany. Police also presented fragments of a blanket found with the remains, and an audience tip later helped identify the blanket's manufacturer. Over the years, numerous theories have emerged about what happened to Sonia Engelbrecht. Sonia's parents developed their own hypotheses in the absence of answers. Their major concern was over some of the holes in Sonia's companion's story from that night. However, they also explored a number of alternative ideas as well. They feared she might have been abducted by a trafficking ring or even targeted by occult groups. Police have dismissed these theories, believing that she likely fell victim to something just as unsettling and disturbing: a chance predator who happened upon Sonia that night. They believe she either willingly got into a stranger's car or was forced, because otherwise someone likely would have noticed her walking alone at that late hour. Investigators have not been able to provide any clear motive given the condition of her remains. Various other theories have also circulated in the media and among the public. Some have speculated about a serial perpetrator, noting other young women disappeared in Munich in the early to mid-1990s under vaguely similar circumstances. In a strange twist, a couple who went missing in 2002 were also discovered in Kipfenberg Forest in 2020. This has led the public to theorize that this forest had been used as a dump site by a serial perpetrator, but as yet, no evidence has conclusively proven this. In the pre-dawn hours of July 17, 1988, 22-year-old Lisa Moss left a house party near the village of Woodford, Ontario in Canada, and vanished into the darkness. Lisa had recently moved back to her parents' home in Owen Sound just the day before and was 5 months pregnant at the time. That Saturday night, she met up with friends, 2 women and a male acquaintance, for a night out. They left Lisa's green 1976 Plymouth Fury at the male friend's rented farmhouse in Annan, near Woodford, and all carpooled to a party down a long farm lane. Sometime around 4:30 a.m., Lisa and the male friend returned to his farmhouse so she could retrieve her car. Lisa drove off into the rural darkness, turning left out of the driveway, and was never seen again. When Lisa failed to come home, her family and the Ontario Provincial Police began searching the area. 2 days after her disappearance, a farmer discovered Lisa's Plymouth Fury abandoned on a secluded, muddy dirt road near Annan. The scene was ominous. The car was stuck in mud with its doors and trunk left wide open. It looked as though someone had tried desperately to free the vehicle from the muck, as mud was sprayed behind the tires. Inside the car, however, there was no sign of Lisa. Investigators combed the vicinity for clues. In the following weeks, searchers found Lisa's driver's license and some personal belongings discarded in tall grass along a road several miles east of where the car was found. The license lay atop the tall grass, suggesting it had been tossed from a moving vehicle. These discoveries deepened suspicions of foul play. Despite extensive ground and air searches in the rural farms and woods of Gray County, no trace of Lisa herself was found in 1988. In the early stages, the mysterious disappearance of a young woman from a quiet community left residents on edge. That summer of 1988, another local woman had also vanished under puzzling circumstances just weeks earlier, heightening fears of a serial predator. Police received numerous tips and interviewed many people. Originally, 7 possible suspects were identified in Lisa's case. All people in her life were present around the time she went missing. Both Lisa's estranged husband, from whom she had separated 6 months prior, and the male friend she had argued with the night before, were looked at but were not considered suspects. Investigators conducted over 150 interviews in the case and pursued leads across the region. Sadly, despite all these initial efforts, her case went cold. By 2009, the investigation, now handled by the OPP's Cold Case Unit, had honed in on a single suspect after years of work. The authorities conducted multiple searches of a particular property in Owen Sound, starting in 2010, using both forensic teams and ground-penetrating radar. Despite these efforts, no meaningful evidence was turned up in the search. Over the years, several theories have emerged about what happened to Lisa Moss, all of which involve foul play. From the evidence, detectives strongly suspect Lisa met with harm at the hands of someone she trusted. While investigators have not named a primary suspect, there is significant suspicion on the male friend who was last with her in the early morning of July 17th. This man, a casual acquaintance who gave Lisa a ride to her car, was among those questioned early on. However, without concrete evidence, no charges have ever been laid. Other early suspects, including Lisa's ex-husband and former boyfriend, were cleared by police and are no longer thought to be involved. However, some suggest that the police may not have looked closely enough into these individuals to rule them out. Another theory is that she was abducted by a stranger after her vehicle became caught in the mud. According to this theory, someone may have pulled over under the guise of helping her, or she may have wandered off to try to find help, only to encounter a real-life monster. All that said, there's no evidence that a random stranger abducted Lisa, but authorities haven't been able to fully rule it out. One major fact I wasn't able to conclusively uncover when I was researching this case is who the father of her baby was. Sadly, pregnant women are at a greatly elevated risk of violence, and this violence is almost always directed at them from the individual who got them pregnant. At any rate, it sounds as though the police likely have a very good idea who committed this act. but simply don't have the key evidence they need to prosecute the crime. For the time being, Lisa remains officially classified as a missing person until evidence proves otherwise. Queen's Day is a popular national holiday in the Netherlands, traditionally celebrated with outdoor festivities and a royal family visit to a town or city. In 2009, Queen Beatrix and her family chose Apeldoorn, a city about 50 miles east of Amsterdam, as the site of the celebrations. The royal family spent the morning greeting well-wishers and were riding in an open-top bus as part of a parade route through the city. The atmosphere was festive, with crowds dressed in orange, the national color, lining the streets to catch a glimpse of the Queen and her entourage on what was expected to be a joyous day. No one anticipated that the day would be marred by violence. Around noon on April 30th, 2009, as the royal parade was nearing its end, chaos erupted. A black Suzuki Swift driven by 38-year-old Karst Tates broke through barriers and plowed into the crowd gathered along the route. Bystanders watched in horror as the car hurtled at high speed toward the royal procession, striking spectators in its path. The vehicle missed the bus carrying Queen Beatrix and her family by only a few feet, then crashed into a stone monument on the roadside. Members of the royal family witnessed the incident. Television footage showed Queen Beatrix gasping and bringing her hand to her mouth in shock as the car careened past. In the immediate chaos, shoes and other debris were seen flying through the air, and people initially thought a traffic accident had occurred before realizing it was a deliberate act. The impact of the car left a scene of devastation. Sadly, 7 people in the crowd were slain almost instantly, and dozens more were horrifically injured. Tates himself was gravely injured in the crash. Police and emergency responders pulled him from the wrecked vehicle and took him into custody at the scene. He was reportedly bleeding and semi-conscious, but in those moments he confessed to police that his actions were intentional and aimed at the royal family. Despite his intended targets being members of the royal family, Tates only managed to cause harm to the individuals in the crowd. As the shocking news spread, authorities swiftly canceled the remainder of the Queen's Day celebrations nationwide. Within hours of the attack, the Queen delivered an emotional televised address to the nation expressing her family's grief and disbelief at the horrific events. Investigators immediately began piecing together Karst Tate's background and possible motives, but many questions remained unanswered. Tates, a Dutch national from the town of Hussen, had no criminal record and no known history of mental health concerns. Police confirmed that they believed that he had acted alone and that there was no indication of any involvement with any radical groups. Early speculation suggests that the vehicle had been rigged up to explode, but the authorities publicly dismissed this in the aftermath. Authorities found that the attack was clearly premeditated, but it was not meticulously planned or executed with sophistication. Several theories about why Tates committed the attack have been discussed by officials, media, and those who knew him. Investigators and journalists uncovered signs that Tates was perhaps a desperate man driven by personal problems. Earlier in 2009, he had lost his job as a night security guard and was reportedly facing imminent eviction from his home. Neighbors described him as normally polite and unremarkable, but noted that he had become reclusive and weird in the months leading up to the attack. Notably, they advised authorities that while he was normally a pretty straight-laced guy, during this period he adopted a mohawk and started dressing like Travis Bickle from Taxi Driver. Now, I'm no psychologist, but when people other than edgy teenagers start comparing themselves to Travis Bickle or the Joker or similar characters, it can often be a sign of trouble to come. In the months leading up to the attack, he also cut himself off from all his friends and family. This has led to the theory that he saw the Queen's Day parade as an opportunity for a mission of vengeance against society after his personal life unraveled. Indeed, the dramatic nature of the act, targeting the beloved monarch in front of a live TV audience, suggests he wanted to make a public statement of his anguish or anger. Mixed evidence emerged, with some suggesting Tates harbored resentment specifically toward the royal family, while other evidence suggested he was fairly ambivalent towards them. A police officer who questioned Tates in the wrecked car recounted that Karst appeared to question whether the Queen had been taken out. His statements given to that officer were muddled, but appeared to express fairly unhinged beliefs about the Queen and the Dutch royal family. That said, he was suffering from a massive and soon-to-be lethal head injury when this discussion with the police officer occurred. However, those who knew him, including his parents, insisted that Tates had never expressed any significant anti-monarchy sentiments in the past. In fact, according to his family, he had spoken positively of Queen Beatrix as a stabilizing figure, though he had expressed a preference to abolish the Dutch monarchy peacefully. No manifesto or any form of writings were found to give any further insight into his reasoning behind the violence. The official investigation confirmed that while Tates was critical of the monarchy, he didn't appear to subscribe to any coherent ideology or cause that would explain the attack. Ultimately, the motive for the attack remains elusive, and the prosecutor concluded that Tates's exact reasons would never be fully explained.